We're in the third week of a series on Amos. He's a prophet in the Old Testament. Very short book, very dense, a lot going on. It's a book about justice and how we conduct ourselves. It's a book about judgment and how God kind of desires people to behave and conduct themselves in a certain way. And so he sends people like Amos to either say, you're missing the mark, or you're doing a great job, which is not very frequent for Amos to say. And so we're on the receiving end of that in some way. And just so you know, especially if you're new, every year at Branches, we go through 2 books of the Bible totally through a series. We do one Old Testament and one New Testament. We did Mark back during Lent before Easter, and now we're going through Amos together. So this is our second one this year. And Amos is not, like I said last week, the coziest book of all time. It's not really great nighttime devotional material all the time. It's kind of scary and kind of heavy, but it has, I think, a lot to say to us in this cultural moment. And so we're in our third week of Amos, talking about today this idea of alignment, how we align ourselves with what God desires for us. And so in that spirit, let's pray together. God, we thank you for this morning, for the blessing of the backpacks, for all the ways that we celebrate, for the positive spirit that we can feel in this room, for all of our guests, for all of our visitors, for all the people that have been coming a long time, for this time in our year where we just give ourselves to this community, where we're excited to jump back into what we maybe have missed over the summer. And we just ask that you would energize us and enliven us and encourage us to connect with one another, to follow after you, to align our lives to your desires, what you want for us. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. At my last church, we would have once a month a calendaring meeting. And some of you are like, cool, that sounds neat. I want to go to that. Where was that? Can I work there? And I share that because it does sound kind of lame, but I share that also to tell you that that was my favorite meeting of the month, was the calendaring meeting, because it helped me kind of get a grander picture of everything that was coming up. And I liked that because then I wouldn't miss important things, which is always good. Then I could see where I could fit in things that I wanted to do or what our ministry needed to do when I worked at that church. And it also kind of helped me get excited about other things that other colleagues of mine were doing in their ministries. And, you know, if we're looking a couple of months out, then I would see things that were coming up that I'd forgotten were happening. I could get energized about that. And also just like the kind of elementary, simple mental satisfaction of like filling in a calendar. Something like tickles your brain a little bit to do that, and like to color code and to like fill the blocks in and to send someone a calendar invite. There's nothing like it for me. I think even if you think that's lame, at some level, we all like that sort of alignment. And even if you don't positively like it, on the other end, on the flip side of this, we all hate when we're misaligned, when we miss something, when we've forgotten something on our calendar, when maybe we misscheduled it and it was on Thursday, but we accidentally put it on Tuesday, and we show up and we think we've been stood up and we actually missed the day, or we missed the time, or we mixed up AM or PM or something like that. We've all been there, and it's the worst, most shameful feeling, again, at least for me, when I realize I've missed something. Tig Notaro is a stand-up comedian. She's great, kind of does that deadpan vibe that I really, really like. And she has this bit, it's so funny. She talks about how like randomly during the week, she will text one of her friends, "What's your ETA?" And she's like, I love it because I'm just imagining them like half dressed, like frantically running around the house, like rifling through their email and their calendar or whatever, all trying to figure out what they were missing. And he's like, sometimes they'll text me back and be like, what? And he'll be like, yeah, we got a seat. We're all kind of waiting, you know? What's your ETA? And then they'll be like, I'm sorry, I don't remember what it was. She's like, and I don't respond. Even just hearing her do that bit, I feel a sense of anxiety because I think we've all been there where it's like, hey, are you coming? Are you going to show up? Where are you? That's the worst one. And she kind of does this to like plague her friends. But yeah, I mean, she's tapping into a feeling, an experience we've all had where we're like, I feel like I'm missing something. Like I've misaligned. Like we're on the wrong page. I'm like, the kind of meme now is like, husband saying like, oh, I'm so glad we have an open Saturday today. And their wife saying like, oh no, like you forgot about all this other stuff, you know? Here's what's coming up for us. We hate to be misaligned. There's this quality, this virtue in Japanese culture called wa. And wa means harmony. And so if you go to Japan or you know anything about Japanese culture, like when people talk about its orderliness and how things fit together, and they would describe that as this virtue called wa. I'm learning a little bit about Japan, Japanese culture, and the Japanese language. And then this idea of wa fits into all different parts of a Japanese person's life and culture. It applies to their words. You want to be a person of wa in the way that you speak. The way they typically put it is like you want to be agreeable. You don't want to be disagreeable. And that means in the way you speak, even if you do on principle disagree with something or you have a different opinion or on the other side of something, you want to be agreeable in the way you speak. So you don't want to be like, oh, you're dumb, you're wrong. You say like, okay, I see it a little bit of a different way. I want to be agreeable and positive. It's in your speech. And not just in your speech, but it's in your conduct too. Like you have this posture of compassion and kindness. I want to talk about that today with the blessing of the backpacks. Like we want all people, not just our children, but all followers of Jesus to have this posture of kindness and compassion. So then you act in harmony. In Japan, you have a posture of a conduct of wa, that you get along. You're easy to get along with. And we all know people like that. Like, I don't agree with everything that they're about, and I'm maybe not totally on board with them in some ways or whatever, but they're easy to get along with. That's harmony. That's wa in Japanese culture. And I heard someone describe it this way. It's really above and beyond just the way that you speak and your conduct. It's just a commitment to conscious living. I think at some level we all want that, like to be a person of conscious living. Like that you do things on purpose. Like things don't just happen to you and you're not kind of like a victim of your circumstances or whatever else. That like you do things and you do them on purpose when you want to do them. You're not then subject to your calendar. You're in harmony. You're in wa with your calendar or with your spouse or with your coworkers or with your friends or with your neighbor. You're doing things on purpose. I heard a pastor one time say, systems eat intentions for breakfast. It was like really poignant for me because it's like I can intend to do things all I want, but if I haven't set up the system, if I haven't set up the ligature, the scaffolding around it, it doesn't matter what I intend to do. It matters what I set out to and plan and am in harmony to do. We want to be harmonious wa people. I think all of that under the surface, this idea of wanting to calendar, have a structured life, have a conscious life, have a wa, harmonious life, is something baked into our humanity, how we're created to be. We all know that feeling of like somebody we so desperately want to be in harmony with to be disharmonious. Or we all know the feeling of like knowing consciously and by conviction, like I know I should really mend this relationship, but I don't really want to because I don't really like the person, but we kind of feel this conviction, I'd say a spiritual conviction, to be in harmony with another person. We all want that at some level, and I think that's at the heartbeat of what Amos is saying today in Amos chapter 7. That's where we're at in this prophecy together. Amos is having these visions now. We've heard his judgments. Woohoo, judgments. And now we're seeing the things that he's seeing that he's then communicating to this divided kingdom of Israel and Judah and how they're going to work it all out. And this is one of those visions, very short, just a couple of verses, and it says this. This is what he showed me. This is Amos speaking. This is what God showed Amos. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Another cheery vision from Amos today. With this repetitious, almost kind of comedic picture of this thing called a plumb line. You can, in fact, get them on Amazon. This is a plumb line. I have tied several knots in it to hold it. I will not swing it wildly as my 12-year-old self desperately wants to do. But this is a plumb line. When it says that Amos sees God, in this vision, standing next to a wall, holding a plumb line, it's something similar to this. This is obviously manufactured piece of metal with a brand name on it. Nothing like this in ancient Near East probably, but the principle is the same. Some sort of line with then what they call a bob on the end, a weighted, typically symmetrical object of stone, of metal, something heavy. Anybody in their profession use a plumb line? I'm curious. It's like pastors and material workers. This is what it's used for. You say like, okay, why is he standing next to a wall? Well, a plumb line is one way to see if something is straight up and down. So you stand next to the wall, gravity on the planet that we live in, the center of gravity will draw it straight. And so you can see with a plumb line if a wall is straight. Sometimes you can see without a plumb line if it's straight or not. And this is a pretty telling way to see if it's off just by a little. Or a plumber might use it to kind of align pipes. Or if you hang wallpaper, you might use a plumb line. And they're kind of out of date now. They're very cheap on Amazon because, you can use lasers or some other sort of technology. But it's kind of a simple way, a way that people have been doing for a long time that's tried and true, that the weight draws the line straight. So what is Amos seeing? He's seeing God anthropomorphized, in some sort of bodily form and some sort of physical capacity in this vision, holding a plumb line next to this wall. What is he saying? What is Amos trying to get across? Well, it's not just in Amos that this idea of a plumb line is used. There's other passages in Isaiah, for instance, I'll turn to these really quick, that use the same image. It was a common image in the Old Testament. If we go to Isaiah 28, for instance, I'll turn there really quickly. In Isaiah 28:17, it says this, "And I will make justice the line and righteousness the plummet," or the plumb line. The line, this thing that you're to be straight against, this thing you're supposed to align against, say that you're the wall and justice is the plumb line. If they're misaligned, that's no good. As described in Amos and in Isaiah, if the wall isn't straight up and down like the plumb line, they tear down the wall. It's no good. Or if we jump forward a little bit to Isaiah 34, verse 11, it says this, "The hawk and the hedgehog shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall live in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it and the plumb line of chaos over its nobles." It's a common image. Sometimes used literally in the Bible. In 2 Kings, there's an image of a plumb line, and it's used to construct a wall. But overall, it's alignment. And for us in Amos, it's alignment among rubble. Alignment among desolation, as described in verse 9. Alignment among a pile of rocks that is no way straight up and down. Alignment along dust and ashes. Alignment among total destruction and confusion. Alignment among people who don't know what their next step is. And as we talked about last week, are longing for God to show up and do something right about it. And so God's answer, God's vision, the picture that he gives to Amos is like, okay, we're going to make it right. And so I'm standing here with a plumb line. Amos is essentially saying this: in all the rubble, in the division between Judah and Israel, in the midst of political confusion and in the midst of war, in the midst of violence, in the midst of the rich oppressing the poor, and in the midst of people butting heads and being misaligned, in the midst of all of that, here's your guide. Picture as Amos did then. You're standing in a pile of stuff. It's your broken relationships. It's your hardships. It's the things you can't overcome. It's the things that you're carrying around that you can't quite shake. It's that thing that you've wondered why you can't stop doing it or why you can't start doing it. It's all of that. It's the rubble around you. We all got a little bit of it or a lot of it. And God says, here's the line. If you continue to read Amos, you see that it's not all desolation. It's not all darkness. It's not all doom. On the other side of it, on the other half of the coin, the other side of the coin is hope. God is saying, in the midst of all the desolation and destruction, I'm not leaving you aimless. I'm not leaving you without a standard. I'm not leaving you without a next step. I'm not leaving you without a guide, physically, literally, this plumb line. I'm not leaving you without something to align yourself with. If everything is in a pile around you, if all of this were to fall into a pile right now before us, but this were hanging from the sky to here, we'd have a starting point. We'd have a place to go to. We'd have a vision for us. We'd have some hope. We'd have not just the plumb line itself, but the one holding it. And saying, look, all this is a pile, but we can rebuild it around this. As I do often in my sermon preparation, I just searched for the term what was most important on TikTok. And I searched for plumb line on TikTok. It's not like a really trending topic, I have to say, but there was a construction worker on there, and he talked about the plumb line in an accent that I will not try to replicate, but was very amusing and exciting. And in his description of a plumb line, he said, all the ways you could use it, he said, it's essentially this. It's to align something up there with something down here. That's pretty simple. And I was like, I can preach that. Something up here where God is, this kingdom that Jesus talked about, the primary object of his teaching, to align what's up here with what's down there. If you want something up there to be straight with something that's on the floor, you hang a plumb line. If you want something that's up there to drop straight to the bottom right here, you use the plumb line. If you want to make sure that everything is straight up and down and touches and meets together, you have a plumb line. Heaven meets earth. Kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. God's whole mission in Jesus Christ. That when we read the prophets, we're not just reading prophets kind of aimlessly speaking into a specific circumstance. We read how it was fulfilled for Amos and then how it's ultimately fulfilled for us. And I would dare to say that God's plumb line, physically, literally for us, historically, there's someone holding, and his name is Jesus. Jesus is our plumb line. Jesus is our heaven meets earth. Jesus is our alignment between God, who seems so far away from us, and this pile of rubble, and Jesus makes it whole. Jesus makes it right. Jesus makes it all well. Jesus is our hope. Some of you, I know, watch Stephen Colbert regularly, and if you haven't watched this yet, he had Nick Cave on recently, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, great musician and poet and thinker and writer. And Nick Cave has faced deep tragedy in his life. He's lost 2 sons, young sons. And Stephen Colbert has faced his own sort of grief and kind of wondering, how do you face this grief? And Nick Cave has this thing called the Red Hand Files, where it's kind of like a, write in for advice or whatever. It's like, I'll ask Nick Cave for advice. I'll see what he has to say. And somebody wrote this to him, and he reads this on Stephen Colbert's show, and I wanted to read it to you as his plumb line, as his straight up and down, as his alignment. This person named Valerio wrote this to Nick Cave, said, following the last few years, I'm feeling empty and more cynical than ever. I'm losing faith in other people, and I'm scared to pass these feelings to my little son. Do you still believe in us, human beings? Here's what Nick Cave says. Dear Valerio, you're right to be worried about your growing feelings of cynicism, and you need to take action to protect yourself and those around you, especially your child. Cynicism is not a neutral position, and although it asks almost nothing of us, it is highly infectious and unbelievably destructive. In my view, it is the most common and easy of evils. I know this because much of my early life was spent holding the world and the people in it in contempt. It was a position both seductive and indulgent. The truth is, I was young and had no idea what was coming down the line. I lacked the knowledge, the foresight, the self-awareness. I just didn't know. It took a devastation to teach me the preciousness of life and the essential goodness of people. It took a devastation to reveal the precariousness of the world, of its very soul, to understand that it was crying out for help. It took devastation to understand the idea of mortal value, and it took a devastation to find hope. Unlike cynicism, hopefulness is hard-earned, makes demands upon us, can often feel like the most indefensible and lonely place on earth. Hopefulness is not a neutral position either. It is adversarial. It is the warrior emotion that can lay waste to cynicism. Each redemptive or loving act, as small as you like, Valerio, such as reading to your little boy, or showing him a thing you love, or singing him a song, or putting on his shoes, keeps the devil down in the hole. It says the world and its inhabitants have value and are worth defending. It says the world is worth believing in. In time, we come to find that it is so. Love, Nick. Hope in the midst of devastation, in the midst of rubble. Hope in Jesus Christ, who destroyed and defeated death by dying, who had power by becoming powerless, who gave of himself, is the most sometimes lonely and indefensible position to have. In the midst of whatever rubble surrounds us, individually, collectively, communally, in our nation and our world, but it's worth defending. And here's the kicker for us. Here's the practical application. Is people who follow Jesus got to be this. We got to stand in the midst of trial and tribulation and say, this isn't it. We can align ourselves with things above. We can align ourselves with hope even when it seems silly. We can be plumb lines. We can be aligned with Jesus. We can be aligned with hope. We can be aligned with love, even as Nick describes it, in small things, in stories we read, and practices of generosity, in the small kindnesses and love. And just as we share with the children today, just to be kind at school does this. Just to extend a hand of help does this. Just to see another person as God sees them, beloved, child, worth something, does this. Just to sacrifice a little, just to give of yourself even for a moment, does this. It may not seem worth it in the moment, but what Jesus calls us to, what Amos calls us to, is to be a plumb line, is to align ourselves with the kingdom, is to pray sincerely as Jesus prayed, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And thanks be to God for that.